I thought tonight would be perfect, the kind of night where I finally proved to my husband's elite family that I belonged. The champagne, the music, the perfectly curated smile, all of it was in place. But then, a single text shattered the illusion. "Do you know the truth about your husband?" I shouldn't have read it. I shouldn't have stopped to help that stranded woman on the highway, but in 30 minutes she would walk into that ballroom and change everything. Not just my marriage, but the power in the entire room. And none of them saw it coming. The ballroom shimmered like a jewel box, crystal chandeliers casting warm gold light across polished marble floors. Every surface glowed. Every sound was deliberate. The clink of champagne glasses, the hush of expensive silk brushing against itself. I adjusted the hem of my deep emerald gown, custom couture, a piece I'd saved for months to afford. Not because I wanted to flaunt it, but because I refused to arrive looking like a footnote in my own story. When I stepped in, heads turned, but not in the way I had hoped. The wives of the board members, with their manicured hands and perfectly arched brows, tilted toward each other, whispering. I caught one glance at my dress and smirk, just barely covered by a sip of champagne. "Second wife wearing designer? Bold choice," someone murmured, just loud enough for me to hear. I smiled, a perfect, cold, polite smile. The kind I'd practiced in the mirror, the kind that said, "I see you, I just don't care." But my fingers tightened around the stem of my glass. Each glance felt like the slow press of a blade against skin. Not deep enough to kill, but sharp enough to bleed pride. Ethan wasn't by my side. He never was. Not at the beginning of these gatherings. He liked to make the rounds, shaking hands, laughing with men whose influence he measured like currency. I scanned the crowd and finally spotted him. Tall, confident, perfectly tailored, in the center of a circle of elite men. He laughed at something, hand on another man's shoulder, not even glancing toward me. I moved toward him, my steps steady, every movement rehearsed. When I reached the edge of the circle, I waited, expecting the moment when he'd pull me in and say, "Gentlemen, this is my wife, Mia." But that moment didn't come. Instead, he angled his body away, continuing his conversation as though I wasn't there. The man beside him nodded toward me briefly, recognition, maybe even curiosity. But Ethan simply laughed and changed the subject. I was still standing there, a ring on my finger, but invisible to the community he valued most. It was small, it was subtle, but it was a crack in the facade I had been holding together for months. I stepped back, my chest tight, trying not to let it show. A familiar voice. One of the wives, I couldn't tell which, spoke just behind me. "Have you seen the messages?" The first wife still controls him. I froze. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to confirm if that whisper was about me, but it clung to me like perfume I hadn't chosen. I excused myself quietly, slipping toward the edge of the ballroom. Outside the main room, the lighting was softer, shadows deeper. I reached into my clutch for my phone, my pulse suddenly too loud in my ears. Notifications blinked across the screen. Calendar reminders, meaningless texts, and then one I didn't recognize. It was from an unknown number. "Do you know the truth about your husband?" The words sat there cold and deliberate. My first instinct was to delete it, pretend I hadn't seen it. But my thumb hovered, then swiped instead. A second message appeared almost instantly, as though whoever sent it knew I was there. "He's still keeping secrets from you." A cold weight settled in my stomach. I glanced back through the open doors to the ballroom. Ethan was still there, still laughing, still perfectly in control. And I, his wife, the woman wearing his ring, was standing on the edge of the evening, holding a secret I hadn't asked for. My fingers tightened on my phone. I had no proof, no context, just the sudden, heavy knowledge that the cracks I'd been ignoring were spreading faster than I'd prepared for. The music from the ballroom swelled, laughter spilling into the hallway, but I stayed where I was, staring at the message. I could hear my own breath, too loud, too quick. Another message appeared, as if on cue. "You'll find out soon enough." I slipped the phone back into my clutch, my heart pounding. I didn't know what was coming, but I knew the evening had already shifted, and whatever was about to happen would not stop at the ballroom doors. The next morning, the taste of the ballroom still lingered. Champagne gone flat in my memory, whispers still echoing. Ethan was already gone when I woke, a neatly folded note on the nightstand. Breakfast with investors. Don't wait up. It wasn't unusual. His life was full of meetings I was never invited to, rooms I was never meant to enter. But today, the exclusion felt heavier, almost deliberate. By late afternoon, I found myself at another family function. This one smaller, a luncheon at his mother's estate. The long dining table gleamed with polished silver and crystal water goblets. Conversation moved quickly, words layered with numbers I knew well enough to follow. Mergers, capital gains, acquisitions. I waited for Ethan to bring me in, maybe ask my opinion the way husbands in public sometimes do. He didn't. When I tried to interject, just once, a small point about digital expansion, he smiled thinly and cut across my sentence. "Mia doesn't need to worry about these details," he said, turning back to his cousin. The table chuckled softly, as though he'd just told a charming joke. I sipped my water, hiding the sting. They didn't see me. Or worse, they didn't want to. In their eyes, my past, a small startup I'd built before marrying Ethan, didn't exist. It wasn't failure that erased it, but the fact that my success hadn't been tied to their world. In this house, accomplishments were only real if they were rooted in their name. As the luncheon dragged on, the sense of isolation pressed deeper. I smiled at the right times, laughed when expected, but I felt like a ghost in my own marriage. Later, as I stood by the window waiting for the driver, I heard the familiar slide of leather shoes behind me. "Mia," a low voice said. I turned. It was Robert, a senior advisor in Ethan's company, a man who'd been with the firm long before Ethan had stepped into his father's position. His gaze was steady, assessing, the way someone looks at a puzzle they've already begun to solve. "I've been watching how things are handled," he said, choosing each word carefully. "And I think you're underestimating yourself." I blinked. "I'm not sure what you mean." He glanced toward the hallway, making sure no one was near. "You built something once, on your own. I know what you're capable of, and I know you're being shut out of conversations you could contribute to." There was no pity in his voice, just fact. He handed me a sleek black envelope. Inside was a single card, no logo, no name, just a secure login and a password. "This will give you access to market research data," he said quietly. "Numbers Ethan doesn't think you should see." My pulse quickened. "Why are you giving this to me?" A faint smile touched his lips. "Because I've seen this family chew through talent before. I'd rather not see them waste yours." Before I could reply, he was gone, footsteps fading down the corridor. That night, I opened the secure link on my laptop in the privacy of my home office. Charts, projections, competitor analyses, the kind of information that could shift entire divisions, flashed on the screen. It was more than numbers. It was leverage. Days later, another message arrived, this time from a corporate investment group tied to the CEO. They were seeking small, agile projects to invest in. Ethan hadn't mentioned it, but I recognized an opportunity. I checked my accounts. Buried in an old portfolio was a fund I'd nearly forgotten. Assets I'd kept separate, carefully maintained under my own name. It wasn't enormous, but it was enough to make a statement. That evening, after Ethan left for yet another investor dinner, I sat alone in the living room, running my thumb along the edge of the investment proposal. My phone buzzed. An email. No sender name, no subject, just one line. "We want to see your next move." The air seemed to thin around me. They weren't asking if I would act. They were waiting for it, and so was I. The login Robert had given me had become my silent weapon. At night, after Ethan had drifted to sleep, or left for yet another late networking event, I sat at my desk, lit only by the blue glow of my laptop. The market data wasn't just numbers, it was a map. I saw weaknesses in competitors, untapped segments, inefficiencies Ethan's team was too insulated to notice. And for the first time in weeks, maybe months, I felt something other than exclusion. I felt control. I began building a proposal, Not a rough outline or a whispered suggestion, but a full campaign, bold, calculated, airtight. I crafted every slide to anticipate pushback, every projection to make refusal seem foolish. And I didn't send it to Ethan. Instead, I sent it directly to the CEO's office. No explanation, no preamble, just the work itself, signed with my name. 3 days passed before I received a response, an invitation, private meeting, executive floor. When I walked into the room, the CEO himself stood at the head of the table. He was older, sharp-eyed, the kind of man who measured people the same way he measured markets, quickly, precisely, with no tolerance for wasted potential. "I've read your proposal," he said, sliding a printed copy across the table. "It's clean, aggressive, and if it works the way you've modeled—" He paused, a faint smile pulling at his mouth. "It's the best pitch I've seen in this quarter." My pulse steadied. "I believe it will work, but it will take bold execution. That's why I want you involved directly." He said. "I'm planning to launch this as our next major campaign. You'll be our lead partner." The words landed with weight. For months, I had been invisible, dismissed at family tables, laughed off at corporate gatherings. Now the head of the company was placing me at the center of something Ethan hadn't even known existed. Of course, news like that doesn't stay contained. By the end of the week, whispers were moving through the upper floors. Some framed me as a strategist, others as an opportunist. But one rumor cut sharpest of all. Ethan ignored his wife's capabilities, so the CEO brought in an outsider instead. That rumor burned its way into boardroom conversations, cocktail lounges, and the polite corners of elite dinner parties, and every version made Ethan look smaller. The explosion came the next weekend. Ethan was waiting when I came home from a planning meeting. He was standing in the living room, jacket off, tie loosened, a drink untouched on the bar cart. "I hear you've been busy," he said, voice deceptively calm. I set down my bag. "If you mean the proposal, yes, I have. You went behind my back, behind our family, but byfasti," he snapped. "Do you think it looks good for my wife to be begging favors from my boss?" I met his eyes. "I wasn't begging. I presented work your team overlooked." His laugh was short, humorless. "You think you're going to build a name for yourself in this circle without me? You don't survive here unless someone protects you." The words felt less like a warning and more like a threat. 2 nights later, I learned just how far he would go. I was invited, if you could call it that, to a family meeting at his mother's estate. The long dining table was smaller this time, but the faces were sharper. His mother, his cousin from legal, 2 board member uncles. Ethan sat at the head like a judge. The conversation wasn't about the proposal. It was about me. They spoke in measured tones about image, reputation, and appropriate roles. Each word was a verdict. They didn't want me to just step back from the campaign. They wanted me to fade entirely. "Your position in this family," his mother said smoothly, "depends on your ability to avoid misunderstandings." It wasn't a discussion. It was exile, dressed in silverware and linen napkins. When the meeting ended, I walked out feeling hollow. The cool night air was sharp against my skin. My car was waiting, but I paused on the front steps. My hands were trembling, not from the cold, but from the weight of being so thoroughly outnumbered. And then my phone buzzed. A message from a number I didn't know. She won't last long. No name, no context. But I knew. The first wife. The one everyone claimed was gone from Ethan's life. And just like that, the quiet cracks in my world felt ready to split open. The warning from the first wife didn't break me. It sharpened me. I knew the family was tightening their circle, building their narrative. The whispers in the ballroom, the family meeting, meant to isolate me. It was all part of a larger effort to make me invisible. But I had something they didn't. The truth. And the truth, if told correctly, could be louder than their money. Robert had told me once that narratives weren't won in boardrooms. They were won in public perception. and so I called in a quiet favor from someone outside Ethan's reach, an editor at a well-respected business publication, a woman I'd once mentored early in her career. We met at a small coffee shop far from downtown, the kind of place where executives never set foot. I slid the folder across the table. Inside was everything: my proposal, the data, and the timeline that showed exactly when I had sent it and when the CEO had acted on it. The editor read in silence, her brow furrowing, then lifting. "This is clean," she said finally. "And you're ready for this to go public?" I didn't hesitate. "Yes, but it's not about embarrassing anyone. It's about proving value where it's being erased." She studied me for a moment longer, then nodded. "Then we'll run it. And we'll run it right." The article dropped 3 days later. The headline was sharp, but not scandalous. The strategy they didn't see coming. My name appeared not in gossip columns or society pages, but in the business section, framed as a strategist who had delivered one of the most innovative proposals the company had seen in years. The response was immediate. Business blogs dissected the proposal. Industry analysts debated its potential. My inbox flooded, not with invitations to dinner parties, but with requests for panels, podcasts, interviews. And most surprising of all, the women who had once looked at me with calculated disdain at galas now shared the article quietly, sometimes even tagging me with messages about breaking ceilings. I hadn't expected the wave, but I wrote it. Ethan, however, was caught in the undertow. At home, he was restless, pacing late at night. At the office, the questions started. Why hadn't he seen the potential in his own wife's work? Why had the CEO gone directly to her instead of through him? The confidence he wore like armor began to crack. And every time my name appeared in a headline, the fracture deepened. And then came the shift that changed everything. The CEO's wife appeared on a televised interview. It wasn't a corporate press conference or a staged appearance. It was a live broadcast on a popular lifestyle program. The host asked about her work, her philanthropic projects, and then, casually, about the rumors swirling in the corporate social circles. The CEO's wife smiled. Not a soft smile, but the kind that carried quiet precision. "I don't often comment on internal matters," she said, "but there's one story worth telling. Months ago, I was stranded on the highway. Dozens of cars passed. One stopped. A woman who didn't know me, who had somewhere to be, helped me without hesitation." The host leaned in. "And that woman was?" "Mia," she said simply. "The same Mia whose proposal is now part of my husband's company's future. I can say without question, her instinct to help and her strategic thinking are one and the same. She acts when others hesitate." It was a short segment, but it landed harder than any article could. Within hours, clips of the interview were circulating online. My inbox exploded again, not just from journalists, but from women I had never met, thanking me for being a voice in a world that too often asked them to be silent. In the days that followed, my image shifted. No longer the second wife in the shadows of a wealthy family, I was now a strategist, a leader, someone with influence independent of Ethan's name, which is why I wasn't entirely shocked when the CEO called me in for another meeting. This time, he didn't bother with formalities. "I want you in the partnership," he said plainly, "not as a silent contributor. As a co-founder of a strategic venture we're launching globally, you've proven you can see opportunities others can't. I want that vision anchored to this company's future." For a moment, I just looked at him. Not because I doubted him, but because I understood exactly what this meant. This wasn't just validation. It was power. Real, undeniable power. I extended my hand. "Then let's build it." As we shook, I felt the balance tip. And this time, it was tipping in my favor. Success had a taste I hadn't expected. Sharp, metallic, almost dangerous. The articles, the interviews, the partnership announcement, they'd all painted me as a figure of strength. But I knew, deep down, that visibility always came at a price. And the bill was arriving fast. It started with a letter, formal, heavy paper delivered by a courier who refused to meet my eyes. Notice of legal action. filed by Ethan, endorsed by members of his family. The accusations were laid out in carefully constructed language: breach of marital trust, misappropriation of proprietary data, and conduct unbecoming of a spouse representing the family name. It was ridiculous. But ridiculous things had power when spoken from the right mouths. Within days, I noticed the subtle shift in the air. Former colleagues avoided me in the office hallways. A woman I'd once mentored wouldn't return my calls. A whisper floated back to me at a networking event: "She's just using the CEO's wife to climb." I smiled through it all, but each word was a small fracture. I knew Ethan's strategy. He couldn't discredit my work, so he would discredit my character. The trial date was set faster than I'd expected. It wasn't just a court case, it was a spectacle. The family positioned it as a private arbitration, but everyone knew the media was watching. When I walked into the chamber, I wasn't just walking toward a judge. I was walking into a room where every glance was a test of how much dignity I could hold under fire. Ethan sat on one side of the table, his mother beside him, a row of family attorneys at their backs. Their posture was immaculate, their expressions carved from ice. I took my place across from them, a single folder in my hand. The proceedings began with their accusations, polished, rehearsed, the kind of language that sounded damning even when it was empty. They spoke of trust violated and assets compromised, all wrapped in the guise of protecting family integrity. When it was my turn, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. I opened the folder. Inside was the documentation they hadn't expected me to have. Emails from Robert timestamped before Ethan's involvement. Contracts signed by me with my personal funds. Records showing my investments had been independent of marital accounts. A clear timeline of the proposal's creation, submission, and approval by the CEO's office. I laid them out carefully, each page placed where the judge could see. My work, I said evenly, was conceived, developed, and funded outside of any marital obligation. It is my intellectual property, and my partnership with the company is based on merit, not on marital connection. Ethan shifted in his seat. His mother's lips tightened. The questioning was relentless. They tried to pick holes in my timeline, to frame Robert's mentorship as collusion, to suggest I had manipulated my way into favor. I stayed steady. Every challenge met with documentation. Every insinuation countered with fact. At one point, Ethan leaned forward, voice sharp. "You wouldn't be here without me." I met his gaze. "You're right. I wouldn't be here. I'd be further." A murmur rippled through the room. Hours passed. By the end of the day, the energy in the room had shifted. The family's confidence was fraying. The judge leaned back, reviewing the documents one final time before speaking. "Mrs. Carter, he said, his voice clear, "your right to pursue your professional endeavors is protected. There is no evidence of contractual violation. The court will not interfere with your ability to continue your work." Ethan's jaw tightened. His mother looked as though she'd swallowed glass. I felt the air loosen in my chest. Not because the battle was over, but because I'd made it through this one intact. As I gathered my papers, the judge's final words echoed like a quiet promise. "Your right to the freedom to pursue your career stands." The ruling didn't feel like victory. It felt like air. For the first time in months, I could breathe without the constant pressure of someone else's grip on my future. But breathing wasn't enough. I had watched how influence worked in this world. It wasn't about winning one case or one promotion. It was about building something so undeniable that no one could erase you again. So I built the mirage to legacy. IFN started as an idea on my desk, nothing more than a page of goals and potential partners. But it grew faster than I could have predicted. Backed quietly by the CEO's office and publicly supported by his wife, it became a venture capital fund dedicated to women founders, the kind of women who, like me, had been told there were doors they couldn't open. We launched in a private room at the CEO's corporate headquarters, but the real heart of the fund was the office we established in a restored historic building. donated space in the same wing where the CEO's wife ran her philanthropic initiatives. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. Months ago, I'd met her on a highway shoulder, nothing but strangers bound by an unexpected moment. Now we were aligned in something much bigger than ourselves. Applications poured in from across the country. Some were scrappy, early-stage ventures. Others were ambitious but underfunded expansions. I read every one, not just because it was my fund, but because I remembered what it felt like to send out your work into a world that didn't think you belonged. Recognition followed. I didn't seek it, but it arrived anyway. At a business gala, one I had once attended as Ethan's silent +1, I stood at the podium accepting an award for visionary leadership in emerging enterprises. The same women who had once whispered about my designer gown now approached with genuine warmth, their words not laced with condescension, but with respect. I thought of the nights I'd walked into these rooms invisible, and I realized something. Visibility isn't given. It's taken, and I had taken mine back. Months later, the fund had grown beyond its original projections. Our portfolio was diverse, our results strong, but what mattered most to me wasn't the balance sheets. It was the founders. I met them often. Women in their 20s pitching ideas no one had believed in until now. Women in their 40s returning to dreams they'd set aside for families. They came to the office nervous, left with term sheets, and sometimes, most importantly, with their confidence intact. I saw pieces of myself in all of them, and I understood the responsibility of holding a position like mine. It wasn't just about keeping my place at the table. It was about making sure there were more chairs. When the invitation for the Global Women in Business Summit arrived, I almost declined. The stage was enormous. An international platform, live broadcast, a room full of leaders from every major market. But then I thought about the fund's founders, about the women watching who might still be on the outside of those rooms. So I said yes. The summit was held in a glass-walled auditorium overlooking the city skyline. The audience was a mix of seasoned executives, investors, and young professionals hoping to see themselves in the stories on stage. When my name was called, I stepped into the lights, not as Ethan's wife, not as the woman who had once been whispered about at a gala, but as myself. I spoke about risk, not just financial, but personal. About the way rejection shapes you, about the resilience that comes from being underestimated. I told them that building the Mirage to Legacy Fund hadn't been about revenge. It had been about rewriting the rules for who gets to hold power. As I looked out across the room, I saw nods. I saw faces that understood. And I realized that my story wasn't just mine anymore. It had become something others could stand on. At the close of the summit, the moderator asked one final question. "What's next for you, Mia?" I paused, considering. "Legacy," I said. "Not mine, ours. Every founder we invest in, every barrier we break, it's all part of something bigger than me. I just had to be the first to walk through the door." The applause was warm, sustained. But it wasn't the sound that stayed with me. It was the sight of a young woman in the front row, notebook in hand, looking at me the way I had once looked at women on this stage. Later that evening, back in my hotel room, I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window. The city lights spread out below like a constellation, and for the first time, the reflection in the glass didn't feel like a stranger. The woman looking back at me was no longer waiting for permission. She wasn't surviving on the edge of someone else's influence. She was exactly where she was meant to be. I smiled, small, certain. And as I turned away, I left the question not to myself, but to the ones still finding their footing. If it were you, what would you do next?